recognizing that you have these ideas, which otherwise would be behind a paywall on some professional publication, versus producing them for public consumption. How do you think about media and journalism for the next 20 years?
Well, there's so many things that are problematic. I mean, one of them is that you have a funding model that is basically not working for all but the flagship publications. So this is the advertising augmented by subscription model. The Washington Post, the New York Times can work like this, but we've seen the destruction of local journalism through this funding model, unfortunately, and so on from online things. AI is going to be a huge threat, generative models of language. There's other stuff, I see this a little bit on Substack. I write a newsletter for Substack, and it creates a very strange financial incentive model because a relatively small amount of people paying in directly to the writer actually can get them to their salary much faster than you would expect, right? I mean, if you're making $5 a month from a subscriber, I mean, you need 1,000 subscribers to have a salary all of a sudden. And that's equivalent to what, a starting salary might be in some journalistic outlets. So depending on if you're working for the New York Times, it might be substantially more. If you're working for local press, it might be substantially less. But the point is, the thing that I find dangerous about that model, and this doesn't affect me as much because I'm mostly writing about big ideas, right? So I'm not feeling like I'm captured by my audience. What I do, I have heard from a person I know who will go unnamed, is he writes from the center left perspective. It's a politics newsletter, huge following, lots of money. The problem, he says, every time he criticizes Joe Biden, he loses money, and substantial amounts.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And so he has to decide, he has criticisms of Joe Biden, but when he decides to hit send on those emails, he's like, I'm about to delete $5,000 from my income. Do I want to do that?
Yeah.
Right? And, whether that is subconscious or not, or consciously done, it creates an incentive structure where it's called audience capture, where if you have a partisan audience, you become more partisan, you start writing more extreme stuff, the audience becomes more extreme. It's a ratcheting effect, right? And I think this is happening to an increasing degree in the sort of independent outlets that are becoming more fragmented and so on in the modern world. But that is something that I think is really dangerous. And as I say, if you're a science journalist, less prone to these problems, or if you're like what I do,
less subscribers too, though.
Yeah, well, that's also true. I mean, it's easier to. I did know. I mean, I will say, I knew that I could make a lot more money if I wrote an anti-Trump newsletter. I mean, I don't. I'm very unsupportive of Donald Trump, to put it mildly, and I have written about this extensively. There's a lot of people who want to have, anti-Trump views constantly reflected back at them, and will pay for it. But I think that there's a lot of people already doing that. I wanted to engage in bigger ideas and so on. But there is this stuff, right? There's if you're purely trying to make money, there are incentives that exist in the modern media landscape, which are not aligned with what's good for society. And I think that's true in AI. I think it's true in some of the funding models for local journalism, and I think it's also true for the fragmented independent journalism.
That's such a fascinating insight from your friend there, because according to the media I've consumed, this sort of personal content creator is supposed to be the way out of this broken journalistic model where you're paying for your political viewpoints reflected at you.
I think
because where does that leave us?
They're both broken in that way. I mean, this is the stuff where when I wrote for the Washington Post, I used to be a weekly columnist for the Washington Post, and my editor was great. He was always saying, write about stuff that's important. Well, the problem is I couldn't see the actual numbers of clicks. I didn't have access to the data. But what I could see were the number of comments. And there's going to be a rough correlation between the number of comments and the number of readers, right? And I wrote this piece about Thai politics. And, I study Thai politics, Thailand. What I think was a very important piece about the nature of geopolitics between China and the US and all this type of stuff and some big questions. It had one comment. I wrote a piece, the next week about what I found to be boring, sort of reactive, anti-Trump, Trump did this and it was bad. 980 comments, right? And you're like, okay, well, at some point, there is going to be a world in which journalistic choices can be subsidized by, the stuff that gets a lot of clicks so that they can have the foreign correspondents who cover other parts of the world and so on. But at some point, it's a business, and this is where there's also stuff. I'm not trying to, well, I am, I guess, trying to critique my former employer's owner, but Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, he's one of the richest guys in the world. They just did this massive round of buyouts and layoffs because apparently they were not, happy with the profit margins. There's a public service in the Washington Post. If you're one of the richest people in the world, just pay for it. Yeah. There's some of that stuff.
It would do so much for your reputation.
What's the, do so much for your reputation. It would do so much for the world. Like, I just think there's a degree to which we have to grapple with that question of, do we want to live in a world where journalism is predicated on eyeballs and clicks, or where we have steady funding streams? And the UK, I think, is a comparatively healthy society relative to the United States. And one of the reasons for that is that 60% of the news media is consumed through the BBC, which the BBC has plenty of things that you can critique about it. But it's a reality-based journalistic outlet that covers a broad array of globally important events. And it corrects its mistakes when it makes them and so on. And that creates a sort of shared reality for a large degree of the public. The United States has nothing like that. I mean, NPR is a tiny sliver of the media landscape, National Public Radio. Fox News is a tiny sliver of the media landscape. So is CNN, so is MSNBC, but everything is getting more and more fragmented. And, the profound insight that I think is worth drawing from this problem is that philosophically, democracy is built on the point of democracy is to compromise based on a shared sense of reality, right? So it's like you agree on what the problems are, you agree what the possible solutions are, and then you compromise. That's basically the gist of democracy in a nutshell. If you take out, for a long time, the compromise was the problem. How do we get to, from point A to point B? The problem in the 21st century is the shared sense of reality. And that's like a fundamental issue that did not used to be a problem when we had, in the US, for example, 3 big nightly news broadcasts. And basically, whether you lived in Alabama or New York, you basically thought the same things were happening in the world. Now, there was a cost to that in some of the corporate biases that may have existed, but there was a massive benefit in the sense that like reality was shared among the population. So there's dangers about the media landscape that I think are being underplayed. It's not just, we'll lose a paper. I think it's like the fundamental bedrock of democracy is informed consent of the governed, and that requires journalism.
And you're at the point, which it seems like it is in the US, where you can consume an entirely different view of the state of affairs than your neighbor, which evidently has many problems down the line. And this kind of brings it back a little bit to the Fluke worldview, but the idea of smaller groups being able to make better informed decisions because there's more sort of mutual skin in the game. Where I live in Sweden, the SVT is the Swedish broadcaster, and they for sure, operate at a huge loss, right? But it is 100% in the service of being a public good. Small 10 million people population. And even there, in the last few years of population growth and economic hard times, you can see the fractures and it's splintering. But it's still an amazing place to tune into the news. An amazing, especially podcasts and radio, to actually tune into. They have people in every corner of the planet who are state employees, but are journalists. And therefore you watch the news there and it's really, really good. And
There's a fallacy I think people have that like, if a journalistic outlet can't survive financially, then it's not worth having. I mean, I think we think about critical infrastructure all the time, right? Like it's like we've got critical infrastructure in terms of national security and nuclear power plants and like now the internet and so on. Information that informs voter choice is critical infrastructure. And I think, there's a question we have to ask ourselves as a society, which is like, do we want to live in a world where the critical infrastructure of high quality information is subject to profit motive? And this is where I think the BBC, the one period in which the BBC is a little bit weird is around the royals, right? So it does stuff where it's you tune in when like the Queen dies and it's like very, very odd. And that's the one time that you really do see like, this is a state broadcaster, right? Yeah. But for the most part, when it's covering stories, like what you basically see is like the funding is state, but like they are savaging the government on the airwaves regularly. And I think that is something that, it's a nice, healthy medium. You don't want the state to dictate editorial decisions ever, But you do want the state to provide stable funding, I think, for at least some journalism to happen, because we have to recognize that it is critical infrastructure. If the information pipelines in democracies break, the society breaks. And the US, I think, is like the perfect test case of this. I mean, you're seeing, I watch this as an American living in the UK, like, I despair for my home country. I mean, it's utterly broken. And it's broken in ways that are very dangerous for the world. And I think it's almost exclusively down to the information pipelines. People believe things that are not true, and this is not a small sliver of the population. It's large chunks of the world, large chunks of the population in the United States that are delusional about reality, and that's really, really dangerous for democracy, because those people decide the future. So you say, do we want to turn over choices to people who don't understand basic reality? Well, yeah, that's the nature of democracy, but it only works if the crackpots and the conspiracists are a fringe point of the population. They're not any longer, right? I mean, like, there was a poll, a quarter of the U.S. population believes that January 6th was set up by FBI agents, right? I mean, it's crazy. It's just utterly crazy, but that's a quarter of the voting population.
That's the population of the UK.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, tens of millions of people. So it's a very scary thing, and I think we do need to reevaluate what is critical infrastructure, and I think information definitely fits the...
I love that. Such a radical idea that the state media should be treated like bridges and roads and electricity and so forth. That's amazing.
Well, there's lots of different ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be state media, but I think the idea that we need to be able to have good quality information for the public, whether that's private or not, as long as
you just move away from the profit infrastructure.
Exactly. I mean, it could be private companies that are subsidized by the state. I don't really care. All I want is for them. I don't want editors to decide what they cover based on what is going to generate clicks. I think that is a very dangerous model to go down, and I think we're there partly. I think that a lot of media outlets are completely dependent on these metrics, which are not the same as what is good for society. There's a mismatch between them.
All right,